Welcome to Present Perfect. No grammar, but plenty of history. I'm Don Congdon, your host and guide, helping you explore how the past reaches out and touches the present. This is podcast number 110. Do you remember the day when you discovered that it took more than a dictionary to learn a new language? Perhaps you were sitting in high school Spanish or college German. Suddenly, you realized that there was more to translation than just converting the words of one language into their equivalent in another. You discovered that you had to learn things like conjugations, declensions, cases, moods, and voices. Even weirder was the fact that not all languages build their sentences in the same order. When I'm talking about my cat in English, I'd probably say something like, "My cat caught the mouse." This arrangement is called subject-verb-object order because the subject comes first, then the verb, and finally the object of the verb's action. But other languages can do it differently. If I lived in ancient Greece, I'd probably say something to the effect of, "My cat, the mouse, caught." We call this arrangement subject-object-verb order. Now that I think of it, however, my cat has never bothered to catch a mouse, so it's unlikely I'd say it in any language. But I think you take my point. Language is a thorny matter, thanks to that little incident mentioned in Genesis chapter 11. And that leads us into today's topic. It's one that will occupy us for quite a few podcasts: Bible translation. As you already know, the Old Testament was translated into Greek during the intertestamental period. Hopefully you remember that we call this translation the Septuagint. It wasn't the only translation of the Hebrew Bible. There were a number of other Greek translations floating around as well. Almost from the time that it was completed at the end of the 1st century AD, the Bible, or some part of it, has been translated into other languages. Translation is just a fact of life in a world in which there are thousands of languages. We're going to begin by looking at the earliest Bible translations, those produced in the Church's first few centuries. Then, we'll spend some time examining the beginnings of the English Bible. As we approach the sequence of events called the Reformation, we'll see how controversial Bible translation became. Finally, we'll wrap up by examining modern Bible translation efforts, those from the late 19th century up to the present. Before we dive in, however, we need to take a little side trip to deal with our old and irascible friend, time. In some of the previous podcasts, I've used numbered centuries and a few specific dates to identify events, but sometimes we need to talk about major periods of time that don't begin and end on nice, neat dates. Historians deal with these periods by naming them and assigning approximate endpoint years. Since I'm going to start using named time periods, I better define them first. Here goes. Classical antiquity comes first. This time period stretches from 800 BC to AD 300. It encompasses that part of history in which Greek and Roman culture influenced and later dominated Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Significant parts of the Old Testament and all of the New Testament took place during classical antiquity. It's also the era in which many famous Greek and Roman intellectual figures lived, wrote, and taught. Aristotle, Sophocles, Euripides, Virgil, Cicero, and Marcus Aurelius are a few examples that you may have encountered. Next comes late antiquity. This period, which lies between AD 300 and AD 800, is the time in which the Roman world was collapsing and transitioning into what we now call the Middle Ages. We've already spent some time in late antiquity when we discussed canonicity, and we're about to spend some more. The Middle Ages is a very familiar period to most people and one that we often romanticize. Some historians refer to it as the medieval period. It lies between AD 600 and AD 1500. Notice that the beginning of the Middle Ages overlaps the end of late antiquity. These periods didn't transition sharply, but just faded from one into the other. Modern Europe started germinating in the Middle Ages. Since the Middle Ages is so long, historians usually divide it into three phases: the early Middle Ages, 600 to 1000, the High Middle Ages, 1000 to 1250, and the Late Middle Ages, 1250 to 1500. All of these dates are approximate, and some historians choose slightly different ones, but they're not meant to be exact. History rarely happens neatly. Also, once again, let me remind you that historical period names and dates were chosen long after these periods had ended. Nobody living in the Middle Ages called it that. During the Middle Ages, most people probably weren't thinking much about academic history anyway. That's enough about time. Let's get back to translation. Translation is a complex subject and one that some people specialize in. We certainly can't cover all of its nuances in a podcast, but I'd like to familiarize you with the major landmarks so you'll understand what a translator deals with. To do this, we need to delve once more into linguistics, one of my favorite subjects. I've already mentioned that translation involves much more than converting words from one language to another. The words are the easy part. It's the grammar that's challenging. All of us have studied some grammar in school, but unfortunately many of our English teachers never got around to telling us what grammar actually is. Let's remedy that. Language's goal is clear and effective communication. To achieve this, we must construct sentences that make sense. The term grammar refers to the principles, rules, and guidelines for arranging words into intelligible sentences. You don't have to study grammar to use it well. Native speakers of all languages automatically acquire their language's grammar just by growing up. So why then do we study grammar in school? The reason is simple. Languages almost always have what linguists call a standard version. This is the official variety of the language. It's usually the form spoken by the movers and shakers of that society. If the language has a written form, people usually learn to write the standard version. When you study English grammar in school, you're learning the grammar of Standard English. Let's clear up a major language misconception. Please keep an open mind about this. No matter what your English teacher told you, there's absolutely nothing sacrosanct, better, or more holy about the standard form of any language. English, for example, has numerous non-standard varieties, and they're all perfectly useful and good. Scottish English, Irish English, South African English, Yorkshire English, Norfolk English, Canadian English, New Zealand English, and Bahamian English aren't standard British English, but they make perfect sense to those who speak them. Similarly, in the United States, Midwestern English, Southern English, West Coast English, New York English, New Orleans English, and Black English fulfill their jobs of communicating just fine, even though they differ from Standard American English. So where do we get the idea that the standard language is superior and everything else is somehow corrupt? Unfortunately, it's the fault of our English teachers. In their passion to teach us correct standard English, they imply that all other versions are degenerate forms of the standard which comes from heaven. Nothing could be more untrue. Perhaps you're wondering why we go to such efforts to learn the standard form of our language if our native version is perfectly good. The name says it all. Standard. We learn the standard form so people will understand us. Let me give you an example. Since I come from the American Midwest, my native tongue is Midwestern English. In school, I learned to speak and write standard American English. It's not hugely different, but there are spots where the two forms diverge. When I have a chat with a workplace acquaintance from New Zealand, it can be a bit challenging. Not only is his accent difficult for me to understand, but his vocabulary and grammar differ as well. I'm sure he notices the same things about me. We manage to communicate, but it's a fatiguing process. When we exchange emails, however, we both tend to use standard versions of English. Neither of us does it perfectly, but it creates enough common ground for us to communicate precisely and effectively. And that, in a nutshell, is the reason for having and learning a standard form of your language. It makes communication easier and more accurate. It also makes social institutions like government work better. We master the standard version so we can be a part of a much larger society and participate at its highest levels, if that's our goal. We don't learn it because it's better or morally purer. Nor is the standard version the original from which everything else descended. People believe all of those things, but they're just not true. Some people go to the other extreme and say that we shouldn't teach standard language in school. Instead, we should affirm the local forms of the language by using them instead. I feel that this idea is wrong, although not for moral reasons. Rejecting the standard language tends to marginalize people and limits their ability to progress in society. Why do this at a crucial part of a child's life? By all means, enjoy the local language within the local group. It's not wrong or inferior. But also know the standard language so it's possible to interact with society at large. It's the best of both worlds. Language is one of those topics that has become so politically and emotionally charged that people are rarely objective about it. It pushes us apart rather than draws us together. But if you stop and think about it, that's why God instituted multiple languages in the first place. God commanded early humans to spread out and fill the earth. Since they spoke a single language, they drew together instead and resisted God's command. Genesis chapter 11 tells us what the Trinity decided to do. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language so that they will not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth. I think it's clear, however, that God didn't make this confusion total. Human societies do have to interact with each other. The fact that we can learn each other's languages and translate between them suggests a certain degree of mercy in God's judgment. The fact that humans develop standardized forms of their languages is another example. Without them, it would be difficult for us to have nations that span large geographical areas. Sadly, our time is up. I love this topic and could talk about it all day. Next time, we'll continue discussing language as a prelude to exploring Bible translation. We'll see how languages communicate meaning and how translators deal with significantly different systems. If you're finding this topic a bit dense, don't worry, we're not going much deeper. But the more you understand, the better you'll appreciate what goes into producing a Bible translation. So until next time, I'm Don Congdon, and this is Present Perfect. Have a great day. Present Perfect is a copyright of Don Congdon. Music is copyright Footage Firm Incorporated. Scripture quotations are from the New American Standard Bible, which is a copyright of the Lockman Foundation.